I want to talk about the market and marketing culture of international criminal law. And what I mean by that is that I think that there are certain parallels between the central paradigms of international criminal law and the central paradigms of neoliberalism. And not only do I think that there are parallels, but I think that neoliberalism is an inherent part of international criminal law. The way I trace that is by first of all looking at the market culture of international criminal law. By that, I mean its growth. And I orient myself along the lines of David Harvey's Enigma of Capital, in which he looks at growth as an aspect of capital being sent in search of new capital. That applies to international criminal law in terms of its progress narrative, which is often placed within a historical narrative of beginning in Nuremberg, a small resting phase, and then a revival with the ad hoc criminal tribunals of Rwanda and Yugoslavia, and then the pinnacle of progress being the establishment of the International Criminal Court. So we see there a growth in institutions, we see a growth in norms, so which areas are seen relevant to international criminal law. And we see a growth in the number of experts and the expertise around this developing field. And what I'm particularly interested in here is inorganic growth. So what I call a mergers and acquisitions strategy of international criminal law. Inorganic means that the growth is happening in not in previously uncharted territories, but into fields which were already populated by certain disciplines and expertise. So international criminal law has created a demand for itself, and then is supplying the answer. So the demand it's creating is one for global justice, for peace, for individual accountability, through stating that there is a particular gap there. However, we already had particular institutions, disciplines. If we think about human rights law, humanitarian law, transitional justice, there are plenty of disciplines which are dealing with questions of global justice, even questions of individual accountability. But international criminal law has sort of swept the stage in a particularly successful manner. And one of the reasons for this is its marketing culture. So we've got growth, the idea of inorganic growth, and then the question of marketing. And why I think international criminal law is particularly successful is because it has this incorporated an idea of branding and an idea of marketing into its logic. So branding means the promise of a particular product. The promise of international criminal law is the promise of global justice. Individual criminal accountability is seen as a way of responding to conflict, to inequality, to terrorism, to sort of 21st century problems, as the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court stated. So it's built up this brand around itself. And it markets this brand primarily to the developed and the big power players. But what is interesting is that it claims, part of its claim is that it is fighting global justice through fighting big power players. Big power players, I mean the economic and the political elites in the world. And in order to understand the problems with branding and marketing, I've used Naomi Klein's book, No Logo, which explains the dominance of branding and the growth of branding in the 1990s. And that's an interesting parallel there, again, between international criminal law and between branding and sort of the growth of a neoliberal logic, in that both really took off in the 1990s. Now, Naomi Klein says that the problem is that image has been prioritized over substance. Now, she explains how this is happening in certain brands, with certain products in the clothing industry and so on, but also how this is happening with certain services, looking at Google and so on. How are they prioritizing image over substance? And I've applied that to international criminal law, looking at how image, the image of fighting global justice has been prioritized over substance, the actual doing something about global injustice. And a very sort of crude way of looking at that is to look at the number of cases and situations which have been dealt with at the International Criminal Court in its over 10-year existence. So only 2 cases have actually reached the sentencing stage by now, and but this is to be put into contrast with the many media opportunities it's taken on, the self-promotional videos, the references in popular culture of the International Criminal Court, and the general sort of placing energies into the building of the brand. The actual cases and situations which the International Criminal Court is dealing with are moving at a much, much slower pace. So image seems to be prioritized over substance in that regard. And there are various examples that could be referred to there. The question then is, what is problematic about this market and marketing culture? So I've already alluded to the big power players. It seems to me that the creation and the use of branding is directed towards the big power players and not directed to those who the discipline claims to be helping, namely the victims of international crimes. Victims don't have any power, generally don't have any buying power. So the branding is not usually useful for victims of international crime. How in particular do victims lose out through this? Well, part of the problem of branding is that it essentializes. Victims, therefore, tend to be essentialized and turned into an abstract entity. That means victims of international crime would often be women and children, might have suffered some form of mutilation and are usually lacking agency. And this sort of essentialized idea of victimhood is then sold to the consumers of global justice, namely those with buying power, who are the economic and the military elites. I was interested in writing about the political economy of international criminal law as part of the project of critical approaches to international criminal law, the CAICL sort of research network. And what we've tried to do in this network is to highlight some of the assumptions that are underlying the discipline of international criminal law. So international criminal law has been, as a discipline, on the rise, as shown with the growth I spoke about earlier. But it seemed to me, and it seemed to those friends and colleagues who are part of this network, that what we were missing was a reflexive notion of what is so appealing about international criminal law. And I think the political economy question there is central. So in the chapter, I draw on critical legal theory, particularly a Marxist tradition, to understand political motivations to benefit particular groups in an economic way. And that inquiry leads one to inevitably to a Marxist inquiry. It seems to me that inquiring into the marketing of global justice and the marketing specifically of international criminal law is important because it's something that we take for granted in our everyday lives when we think about products, and particularly products and services. We think about it's pervasive in our everyday, branding is pervasive in our everyday lives, but we fail to recognize how branding and marketing are also pervasive in international organizations, in international law through its language and its institutions and its experts. And we don't realize how we are placed as consumers, or how we are in fact implicated in the creation and the maintenance of a particular brand of global justice. So I think it's very relevant today as a condition of today's society, of which law is a part. I am working on expanding the research on victimhood and international criminal law. In particular, I've been looking at this creation of the ideal victim because it actually has taken me beyond international criminal law into other areas, related areas, where I found that it's interesting not only how I've spoken about the International Criminal Court and how it creates an idea of victimhood, but how NGOs do this too, and how governments do this too. They all create a certain stereotype of victimhood and a certain essentialized version of victimhood, which is part and parcel of the branding of victimhood. And my concern is with how victims are increasingly the faces of global justice, but not the recipients of global justice.